Howdy, Lucas here. And today I just want to talk to you really quickly about a question that I get asked all the time by students and people just starting to play guitars. What kind of strings should I buy? So, specifically, we're really going to be talking about electric guitar and we're going to be talking about steel string acoustic guitar. I will touch on bass quickly, but I'm not formally a bass player and I'm also not formally a classical guitar player, so I'll leave those topics to other more experienced people. I know there's a lot of videos about this topic out there, but I just felt the need to make one because there's just a lot of misinformation, and I think it'd be useful as a beginner player for those people that are watching this to kind of learn from someone who's played a lot of gigs and studio sessions and stuff like that. Because I've tried a ton of different strings, and I'm around a lot of guitar players in LA that really do this. So first of all, the number one tip that I can give you is, especially if you just bought a new guitar, go on the website of the manufacturer, and literally they always write the stock strings that come with the guitar. So that'll tell you exactly what gauge came with the guitar at the beginning from the factory. And it'll also just give you a general sense of what is recommended. So that information is really useful. So in my case, this guitar is kind of a different story, but one of my newer guitars, this Ibanez AZ, came with Diodario 10 gauge strings, I believe. So great, that makes it really easy. I stuck with 10 gauge, and that is the number one thing that I feel like people maybe are not aware of. You really can just go online and figure out what exactly came with your guitar stock from the factory. But anyway, just to backtrack a little bit, so guitar strings come in gauges, which essentially tells you, so it'll have a set of 6 numbers for 6 string, or 7 for 7 string, 4 or 5 for bass. That number tells you exactly how thick the string is. So thicker strings are going to create more tension on the neck, so it's actually going to bend the neck forward a little bit. It's going to be tighter. It's going to be harder to bend. And there's a misconception out there that using thicker and thicker strings improves your tone, and it does not. It does change your tone. It may make it better for certain things, worse for other things, but certain players will prefer actually using lighter gauge strings versus thicker, and some other players will use thicker strings. And generally speaking, right now in 2022, most guitars, especially electrics, are going to be very close to around like the 10 gauge mark. Many years past, like in the 70s, according to Rick Beato, they used to use 9s, 8s, and thinner strings, but now 10 seems to be like the general recommendation. So here's an example of a standard 10 gauge set. These are Rotosound strings, and the gauges go starting from the high strings. The high E string would be 10, 13, 17, and then it says 26W. W stands for wound. So if you look at your guitar, these lower strings, they're wound versus the higher strings that are not wound, so they're smooth. Wound strings are smooth. So as you can see here for these rotos, hopefully you can see, we go 10, 13, 17, and then 26W stands for wound, 36W, 46, 56. So these bottom 4 strings are all wound. The reason why they specify that is because some players like to have a G string wound as well, and that can be common if you're using thicker gauge strings. So you just want to check if, I would say my general recommendation would just be to get the low 4 strings wound and then the high 3 strings normal. And that, if you're using 10 gauge, 9 gauge, or even 11s, that should generally be what it is. But if you're just wondering what the W stands for, that's that. So generally, the guitar strings will be in 2 groups. So there's like kind of the standard strings, which do not have any type of special coating. And then there's other strings that are also popular, as an example, these Elixirs that have a special coating on them. And the coating does 2 things. It makes them last longer, and it makes them a little slippery, which is kind of nice for certain players if you prefer that. The thing about guitar strings is it really just depends on how much you play and the humidity and various factors. But when your strings get old and crusty, your intonation starts to go, and for that reason, I actually really recommend to people that they change strings depending on how frequently you play, and depending on the type of strings that you're using. Obviously, if you're using elixirs, you could maybe get away with doing it once a month, once every 2 months. But if you're using normal strings, for me, because I play every day and I play for hours and hours and do gigs and stuff like that, I will change strings fairly frequently if I'm using regular strings. But that depends on your personal situation. For acoustic guitar, here's another. So these are just some sets that I just happen to have in my shelf. But these are Elixir coated strings for acoustic. Every string brand will not only have different gauges, but they'll have a couple different models that essentially have different tonal characteristics. So these acoustic strings are called the Phosphor Bronze. If you look on the back of Elixirs and most other string companies, or at least on their website, they should have all this information too. But it'll explain to you exactly what the tonal characteristics are of their different coatings or of their different string constructions. So I would not recommend a coated string to most people just because they're very expensive. So a coated string could cost you $15 or more. But regular player, you could probably just use normal strings. I recommend coated strings to people that are extremely lazy and never want to change strings. So that number one, if that's you, then go for it. Number two, I'd recommend coated strings, especially these Optiwebs. I really like these for electric guitar because they're bright sounding. For players that like a really slippery feel on their strings. Not everyone likes that though. It can mess you up if you're not used to it. So that's that. For electric guitar strings, some people in the jazz community will prefer to use flat wound strings. So if you're looking for flat wounds, that can be a thing. I personally don't recommend those. But if that's what you're into, or if people are telling you to get those, then you just get flat wound strings. So they have different construction. They're flat. These are the normal strings. These ones that I've been showing you are considered round wound. So that's the difference. Round wound are I probably can't zoom in enough, but they're wound around the core of the string, so they make this kind of noise when you scratch them or move around them, whereas flat wounds are completely flat and super smooth, so you can slide, but they sound much darker, and they're super popular in the like for bass players as well. So if you're a bass player, you might be looking at flat wound strings. Here's a set of bass strings that I have, Diodario NYXLs. The NYXLs are great for electric guitar too. I really recommend those, and just regular Diodarios are totally fine too. And just off the top of my head, a couple string companies that I've used over the years that I would definitely recommend checking out if you're not sure where to start. So Diodario are very widely available. They're not my favorite, but they work. Elixir, if you're looking for coated strings. For non-coated strings, if you're really into bending and like playing like heavy rock guitar, check out Rotosound strings and DR strings. I really like DR strings. And for bass strings, you may want to check out Ernie Ball and Labella. Makes really nice strings. They make great flat wound strings. Labella also makes really high quality guitar strings as well. Those are just some recommendations off the top of my head. I know 100% that those string companies make very high quality strings, and I don't think you could go wrong. There's obviously numerous other brands out there. I would not personally recommend going down the rabbit hole unless you're a very, very advanced player. Do not go down the rabbit hole of messing around with like complicated gauges or custom strings. I know there's websites out there where you can order like each, custom sets and all that they calculate the tensions and all that. That would be cool in theory, but I've gone down that rabbit hole and it's not worth it. One of the most important things that I should really explain to you is that this is why I mentioned in the beginning of the video, check what your guitar has either been set up for or came from the factory set up for, because you can't just change the gauge of strings drastically, because it puts a lot of stress on your neck and it's going to throw off your intonation because it's going to be so much tighter. Well, if you get a thicker string, it's going to be much, much tighter. It's going to throw off your intonation, and vice versa. If you get a much lighter string than your guitar is set up for, it's going to throw off your intonation, and the nut up here needs to be filed correctly for the string. So for example, on bass, if you get a really, really thick string, it may literally not even fit into the nut, and you need to bring it into a tech to have them file it properly if you don't know how to do that, and that's like a whole thing. So stick with whatever the guitar is set up with from the get-go, or whatever it came with from the factory. For now, I would say, unless you're an advanced player and you're really looking to do something specific, typically, just off the top of my head, people that experiment with using really, really thick strings are trying to do very low tunings on guitar, baritone guitar, 7-string, those types of things, specialty applications, and same thing for bass. And then people that use really, really light strings, those would be beneficial, like if you have hand issues, like carpal tunnel or whatever, you want the strings to bend really easily. Or if you just play with a really light touch and do a lot of bending and stuff like that, and you want the strings to be really, really small and nuanced and slinky. There are some tonal differences, like I mentioned earlier, but just going heavy will not necessarily improve your tone. It will change your tone a bit. There's a bunch of videos on that. Rick Beato actually has a great comparison, but that's just like a rabbit hole, and I don't really recommend that beginner and intermediate players go down that. I say stick with your 9, 10, maybe 11 gauge strings, or whatever your guitar came with or is set up with, and just roll with that for now. And then if you get more advanced and need like a more specialty type of application, then you can go down the string rabbit hole and try to figure out whatever gauges you need to do drop A or whatever crazy tuning. So anyway, let me know if that was helpful. I'll talk to you guys later. Peace out.